Hey everyone, welcome back. So, presidential pardons and commutations are back in the headlines again.
Yeah, it seems like they always spark a lot of debate, right? Like about fairness and accountability and all that in the justice system.
Definitely. And, well, this time it's no different. I mean, you've got two cases everyone's talking about. You know, President Biden pardoning his son, Hunter.
Right, for those gun and tax charges.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's the commutation of that former judge, Michael Conahan's sentence.
The kids for cash scandal.
Yeah, the kids for cash thing. Wild stuff.
Definitely makes you think, right?
Totally. And that's where we're diving deep into both of these cases today. You know, really trying to figure out what it all means, what it says about presidential clemency.
Lots to unpack there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But before we get into it, if you're enjoying these deep dives with us, you know, exploring all these complex issues, well, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Always good to have you along for the ride.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get started. What strikes me is how these cases, while totally different on the surface, both kind of get at this tension we see in our justice system, you know?
Absolutely. It's like, how do we balance mercy and accountability?
Yeah.
What role does public perception play? And then there's always that question of, you know, potential abuse of power.
Right. Big questions. So let's break it down, starting with Hunter Biden. I mean, he was facing these charges for tax evasion, right?
Yeah.
And illegal gun possession.
And got a full pardon from his father, the president.
You know, a full unconditional pardon.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not surprising that it caused a huge backlash.
It definitely set off a firestorm. I think the optics alone are, well, pretty problematic for a lot of people.
For sure.
And, you know, it's not just the look of it. Critics from both sides, Democrats and Republicans alike, are saying this pardon undermines the idea of equal justice, you know?
Right, that whole justice is blind concept.
Exactly. It fuels this perception that there are two sets of rules, one for the connected, the powerful, and another for everyone else.
And that they can basically get away with things others can't.
Yeah, that's the worry.
So it definitely raises questions, right? About how far presidential power reaches.
Yeah.
And whether it's being used, I don't know, maybe for personal reasons or political gain?
Absolutely. Especially because, well, the White House has said they're looking at more clemency claims.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that kind of makes you wonder, right? Could this be a sign of more controversial pardons on the way, you know, before President Biden's term is up? It's definitely a possibility that's got people talking.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about Michael Conahan. He was a judge in Pennsylvania.
Right, and he got caught up in that infamous kids for cash scheme.
Oh, man, that was a crazy story. Basically, he was taking bribes to send kids to this for-profit juvenile detention center.
Essentially profiting from their incarceration, a major abuse of power.
It's mind-blowing that someone in his position would do something like that.
Yeah, really disturbing stuff.
So he was sentenced to 17 years, right? But then he got released to house arrest during the pandemic.
Right, and he was supposed to go back to prison.
But then President Biden commuted his sentence.
Yeah.
So now he doesn't have to go back.
Which, as you can imagine, has sparked a whole different kind of outrage.
It's interesting, though, right? Like the Hunter Biden pardon. I mean, that criticism was immediate. Everyone was talking about it right away. But with Conahan, it seems like the anger is building more slowly. Why do you think that is? Like, what does it say about, you know, how the public sees these cases and maybe the role of the media in all of this? I'm really curious to hear your take on this. And hey, if you're finding this comparison interesting, you know, hit that like button.
Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating contrast. I think in part it might have to do with the nature of the crimes themselves. I mean, Hunter Biden's case, it was serious, don't get me wrong, but it involved, you know, financial misconduct, personal stuff. And it kind of plays into this existing narrative people have about like political elites and corruption.
Right.
But Conahan, his actions were, well, they were more insidious. It was a deliberate exploitation of vulnerable kids for profit. And it took time, I think, for the full extent of the harm he caused to really sink in for people.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like with Conahan, it wasn't just about breaking the law. It was about betraying the trust that people put in him as a judge.
Exactly. And I think that's what's really fueling the outrage now. It's almost like the Conahan case, it needed someone to champion it, you know, to bring it back into the spotlight.
Someone like Governor Shapiro. He's been pretty vocal about it.
Yeah, he has. And he's not just focused on Conahan himself, he's bringing up the bigger issues too, like, the whole for-profit prison system.
Which is something we've talked about before on the show, right?
Right, and the Kids for Cash scandal, well, that's a prime example of how that system can go wrong, you know? Conahan, he wasn't just some bad apple, he was part of this whole machine where money, like, literally drove decisions that hurt kids.
And it's scary to think that's happening, right?
Yeah.
That profit could be put ahead of, like, actually helping these kids, reforming them.
It's definitely troubling. And it's especially concerning because, well, Pennsylvania, they've got a higher percentage of kids in private prisons than any other state.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that bad.
Yeah, it's pretty stark.
Yeah.
So it suggests that there's this, like, systemic issue going on, where the focus is on making money, not on what's best for these young people.
So maybe that's part of why people are so angry about the Conahan commutation. Like, it's not just about him, it's about the whole system he represents.
Right, exactly. It's like this delayed reaction to these deeper problems the case exposed.
It's not just about one guy's punishment. It's about this possibility of widespread abuse. When you mix profit and the justice system, it's a recipe for trouble.
Yeah, and that's kind of where these two cases, Hunter Biden and Michael Conahan, they come together. They both highlight how much power the president has when it comes to clemency.
And how that power, it could be seen as, like, going around the system it's supposed to be upholding.
It's this weird paradox, right? Like, presidential clemency is meant to be a check on the system, a way to offer mercy, correct injustices. But in these cases, well, using that power, it's become the source of controversy itself.
So we're kind of back to square one, huh?
Yeah.
Like, what is justice? How do we define it?
It forces us to confront these tough questions, right? About the nature of justice. What are the limits of executive power? How much does public perception matter? And it also makes you think about, like, what are the safeguards we need to make sure these clemency decisions, they're made with transparency and accountability.
It's not just some philosophical debate either. These cases have real consequences for the people involved, their families, the communities affected by their actions.
Right, like with the Kids for Cash scandal. That left scars on the lives of all those kids, their families, and it really damaged people's trust in the courts.
It makes you realize that while we focus on these big headline-grabbing cases, they often point to these larger systemic problems, like the for-profit prison issue. It's just one example.
Yeah, and these cases can be like a wake-up call. Like with Conahan, it's making people look closer at the clemency process itself, how these decisions get made, whether there are enough checks and balances to prevent, like, abuse or mistakes.
And the media plays a role in all of this too, right? With Hunter Biden, the scrutiny was immediate because, well, he's the president's son. Huge political implications. But with Conahan, it took time. People had to learn about what he did, hear from the victims.
Which shows how important it is to have a free press. And for people to be engaged, to hold those in power accountable. Demand transparency. Make sure justice is applied fairly.
It really feels like we're at this point where the whole idea of our justice system, the very foundation of it, is being questioned.
Absolutely. We're wrestling with this tension, individual accountability versus fixing the system, mercy versus punishment, and, like, can power be used for good? Or can it be manipulated?
It's a lot to think about.
It really is. And then there's the question of, well, what happens next? What are the long-term consequences of all of this? How do we balance, like, the need for accountability with compassion? And how do we build a better system? One that's more just, more fair, and truly works for everyone.
It's a lot to grapple with. These cases, as messy as they are, I think they offer us a chance to really step back and think,
Definitely. A chance to reflect on what we expect from our leaders, from the justice system, from ourselves even.
Yeah. It's easy to get caught up in the emotions of it all, right? The anger, the justifications.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But if we take a step back, analyze things a bit more deeply, I think we can actually learn some things here.
Like, for instance, with Hunter Biden. His pardon really makes you question how much power a president should have. And whether there shouldn't be some, like, stricter rules around it, especially when it involves their own family.
Right. Like, are there any limits? And that brings us back to this whole idea of transparency, which we were just talking about. The Biden administration, they said they couldn't really look into every single clemency case when they were doing those mass commutations.
Yeah, they said they couldn't focus on the individual details.
Exactly. But that raises the question, right? How can we be sure that decisions like this, which affect people's lives, are being made carefully fairly.
And in a way that everyone understands,
It should be clear how these things are decided.
Absolutely. And this goes back to that fundamental tension we've been talking about, right?
Yeah.
Mercy versus accountability.
Right. We want a system that gives people second chances, recognizes that people can make mistakes, learn from them, but we also need justice, and we can't forget about the victims.
It's a tricky balance to strike. And these cases show that there's no easy answer. I mean, the Kids for Cash scandal, I think that really drives home how dangerous it is when profit gets mixed up with justice.
Oh, for sure. It makes you wonder if for-profit prisons can ever truly be, fair, or if they just create these incentives to lock people up instead of actually helping them.
Yeah. It's a question we need to keep asking ourselves. And it's not just on lawmakers and judges to figure this out, It's on all of us. We have a responsibility to be part of this conversation.
Absolutely. To educate ourselves, speak up about what we believe in, push for a more just system.
What I find hopeful is that, all this controversy, it is getting people talking, debating, even calling for changes.
Like with Conahan, for example. It's put a spotlight back on what's happening to kids in the justice system and how these for-profit prisons operate.
Which reminds us that, public pressure can actually make a difference.
It can. Staying informed, having these conversations, fighting for what's right. It all matters.
Yeah, it does. Well, as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. Consider these cases, the issues they raise, the questions we've been talking about. What does justice actually mean to you? How do you balance mercy with accountability, with fairness, and what can each of us do to make the system better, to make it work for everyone?
Great questions to ponder.
And if you enjoyed this discussion, exploring all these complex issues with us, hit that subscribe button and leave us a like. It means a lot to us. Thanks for being here with us today.